So the first part of this prototype we're going to focus on is actually one of the smallest details, which is this toggle switch. So I know there are other tutorials for building a switch, but we can learn a lot of concepts just from building out this small component. So I think it's worth doing again, even if you've done it before. So I'm going to create a brand new Framer file for this project, and then head straight into the code tab and create a new component called switch. So I'll delete the Framer sample code and then set up the basic structure for my code component. I'll import React and Framer. Then I'll create a new function called switch that accepts a props object. And I'll need to use this component outside of this file, so I need to remember to export it. And then to start out, I'll just have my component return just a default frame element. Now I should be able to switch over to the canvas and see my component in the Components tab. Now I'll create an iPhone size frame and drag out my switch component onto that frame so I can open the preview and see the component as I build it. And I'll lock the preview to always show this frame. So back in the code, I can create the visuals for this switch pretty easily. I only need 2 frames, one for the background and one for the little toggle that goes back and forth. Now I'll add some styling to the frames to make them look how I want. So for the background, I'll set the width and the height. Then I'll set the border radius to be half the height to make sure that the rounded corners meet up exactly and make this nice pill shape. And I'll set the background color to this dark purple. You can choose a different color if you don't like this purple color scheme that I chose for my app. And then lastly, I'm going to give it a 1 pixel solid border with a slightly darker purple color. So the format for describing this border style comes from CSS. So it's just size, style, and color in that order. I could define those 3 properties separately, but I prefer this shortcut syntax. You can look up the CSS documentation if you want to learn more about how those borders work. Now the toggle I want to be a little white circle inside of this purple background. So I can set the size, which sets the width and the height to the same value. Set the color to white, and again I want to set the border radius to half the height. Or in this case, since I want it to be a perfect circle, I could just set it to 100%. Now I want the toggle to be slightly inset from the background so that I'll always be able to see some space around it. So I can just set the top and left properties to bump it down and in slightly from the left. And then I also want to give it a slight drop shadow. Again, this format comes from CSS, so the order of these is X offset, Y offset, the blur amount, and then the color of the shadow. So I'm defining my color as RGB alpha, so this is a black shadow with a 20% opacity. It's kind of hard to see that on this dark purple, but if I lighten the background color, you should see that shadow a little better. Now notice I put my toggle frame inside the frame for the background. That's because I want the position of this frame to always be relative to the background shape, which it will be if that shape is the container for the frame. So if I move the background, the toggle goes with it without me having to reposition it separately. And I also think it just makes sense that since the toggle is visually contained by the background frame, that we should have it semantically contained by the background in the markup as well. So that's pretty much all we need to do to create the visuals for this switch, just 2 frames. Of course, we don't want to just have visuals for a switch. We want to be able to click this to interact with it too. So in order to do that, we need to be able to detect when someone clicks or taps on this switch. Luckily, all Framer frames have a built-in property called onTap that lets me do just that. So this is a property that I can add to a tag, just like I did with all these visual properties. Now remember what these properties are. These all get passed into the component, the frame in this case, as props variables. And these different properties can hold different types of values depending on the property. So some properties we set to numbers and some we set to strings. And this onTap property needs to be set to a function. Specifically, it should be set to the function that I want to run whenever anyone taps on this frame. Where would I get a function like that? I will have to create it. So I'm going to create a function called handleTap by using the function keyword. And I'm creating this function inside the main function for my component, which starts here. Now, a function inside a function, it might seem strange at first, but it's actually a very common thing to do in JavaScript, all very legal and very cool. So before I try to make my function actually do anything, I just want to verify that this works. So inside my function, I'm just going to print out some text to the console. I do that by calling this function console.log with the text I want to print. And if I open the console in the preview window, I should see the word tap get printed out every time I click the switch. So this handleTap function is called a callback function because this function gets called back whenever this tap event occurs. So there are a lot more interaction events that we can listen for and set callback functions for, things like hover and drag or pan events. You can find the names for all those props if you want to use those in the Framer documentation. I'll just quickly add a separate callback for the onHoverStart event. So we can see that whenever my mouse hovers over the switch, my handleHoverStart function gets called, and the console prints out hover. And if I click it, my other function gets called and it prints out tap. So these two different functions are getting called depending on the interaction event that's occurring. Now, since we're designing a mobile app, hover doesn't really make sense, so I'm going to remove that. Now, before we can make our switch do something meaningful, we need to learn about how to deal with state in React components. And that's kind of a big topic, so I'm going to put it in its own video. So in this video, we just set up the visuals for our switch, which we already knew how to do. But the new thing we learned is that we can define our own custom callback functions to get called when interaction events occur. And we just pass those callbacks to the appropriate gesture event in the properties of a frame element.